deep in the woods of the Watchung Reservation area in Union County in New Jersey, is a place called the Feltville Historic District. If you go there, you will find a cluster of houses dating back to the mid-19th century, most of which are long abandoned. The site is known locally as the Deserted Village and is known to have many hauntings and supernatural events. The forest was settled in 1736 and a small sawmill was built there. Throughout the rest of the 20th century, the deserted village would go through alternating periods of habitation and abandonment. You have to wonder, why would people leave this village so many times? Did something drive them off these lands? Many people have talked about a certain sense of dread that comes over them while walking through the abandoned village and forest. After hearing all the stories, I decided to check the place out and went there on a drizzly gray day. After walking through the forest, I had a feeling of being watched, and the air just felt heavy. I passed the first house on the hiking path, which had a sign which said people actually lived there, but all the windows were dark. The second building held an interesting museum spelling out the history of the deserted village. But it was getting late, so I didn't get to spend much time there. As I moved deeper into the gloomy woods, in a few minutes I reached a line of abandoned white houses that were in varying states of decay. They were all very sad looking, with peeling paint and rotting wood on the outside of the houses. As I stood there, the wind moved through the trees, causing them to sway, casting ominous shadows over the buildings and path. This caused it to seem like the buildings were expanding ever so slightly, like they were breathing or something like that. An icy feeling ran down my spine. I felt like I was looking at a resting predator or something. I stood in place for what seemed like several minutes until the wind died down. All the windows were dark black eyes peering back at me. For some reason I felt drawn to get closer to the structures. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was being pulled by an invisible hand. I trudged toward the dilapidated house, ignoring the caution tape around it. I could smell mildew and an oppressive decay that filled the air like something that was slowly dying. I could see that the porch had chunks of wood missing, leaving gaping holes in the darkness underneath. Many of the windows were boarded up to protect it from prying eyes, or was it to keep something from hungrily looking out at passerbys? Eventually I was able to find a window that wasn't boarded up, and I peered inside. For some reason, at least to me, the rooms inside looked and felt worse. Maybe it was because I could imagine the people had lived there and now they were long gone to places that only they know. The walls were stained from water running down them, and peeling chunks of paint landed on the floor. In places, the ceiling hung down and looked ready for full collapse. I stood there looking in, and then I heard a creaking sound, like somebody or something was moving around me. I glanced around the porch but saw that I was alone. Then I realized the sound was coming from inside the house. It sounded like footsteps, and I thought I could see a shadow inside. At some point, the alarm bells went off in my head, and I decided it was time to go. I ran 100 feet away from the house and turned back to see if anybody or anything was coming out of the house after me, but all I saw was nothing except the dark windows peering back at me like a doll's eyes. I held my ground for a minute until I heard a low whispering coming from the house. The volume started to grow, and I felt a cold blast of air hit me full on. A queasy feeling grew inside me, and I felt disoriented. For a brief moment, I thought about walking toward the White House. I was able to shake that feeling, and this time I ran full tilt until I was well out of sight of the dead houses. My walk back to the car felt very long as the psychic exhaustion from my encounter drained my energy. I played back what had happened in my head. It could have just been the wind and some raccoon or something inside the abandoned home. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to go back and check that out. I had heard of the deserted village in the Watchung Nature Reserve in New Jersey while I was traveling in the area. It sounded interesting, and I liked checking out spooky places, so I decided to give it a visit. The nature reserve is in the top middle of New Jersey and not far from New York City. I got there on a gloomy fall day, and I made my way into the forest down the wide path. There were a few people there, but the threat of rain, I guess, kept many people away. I passed a house that was marked a private residence, and then I checked out the museum, which had a decent overview of what you would find in the woods and the history, but it left out the scary parts, which was a bit disappointing. I did see there was a cemetery on the hill behind the museum, so I thought I'd check that out first. I made my way up the hill, and I heard a small girl crying. I looked around, and there was nobody on the path or anywhere near me. The sound quickly faded, and I wasn't able to pinpoint a location, so I just chalked it up to the sound traveling up from the main trail. I crossed a small wooden bridge, and I heard the crying again. I paused to try to locate the source, but came up empty a second time. I trudged up the hill and finally reached the cemetery, which was very small, holding only 5 graves. It was kind of disappointing. One of the graves was for Peter Wilcox, who was an Englishman and the first settler here who had moved here from Long Island about 1736 and operated a sawmill. I guessed that this place had driven him to his death, but I could never find much info on the specifics of his passing. I had learned all I could from the tiny cemetery and went to make my way back down the hill towards the museum. As I made my way along the trail, I heard a girl crying again. But this time it was joined by another girl. I spun around, and the trees were bare, and I couldn't see anybody nearby. This was beginning to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a spike of fear ran down my spine. I picked up my pace and I crossed the bridge again. Now a third set of cries joined in. The voices seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. I was at the end of the bridge looking back up the hill when I heard the sound of feet on the wooden planks. But there was no sign of anybody on the bridge but me. An oppressive wave of cold air hit me and I saw my own breath, despite it being in the low 60s that day. I was stuck in place as the footsteps got closer. Finally, I broke free and spun. I dashed away at top speed toward the museum. Anybody who saw me must have thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. I eventually reached the museum and paused at the side of the building to catch my breath. The crying voices were gone. I regained my composure, and then a sound drew my attention from underneath the portion of the museum. It was very slight, but I could have sworn it was from a small girl. It sounded like laughing. Like they were making fun of me. I backed away and got on the main path and the people on it. That made me feel a little safer. I would later learn in 1912 that 3 young girls all went camping deep in the woods, but never returned. All that the searchers ever found were their bonnets, and many say that the fears of the people caused almost half the residents to move away from the village. Those that remained never let their children go deep in the woods without supervision. I think of the deserted village and those 3 girls and wonder, what were they doing that day and what happened to them? When I was in high school, 3 friends and I were hanging out at a restaurant, and it was a Saturday night, so we were bored out of our minds. So one of my friends said, "Hey, let's go to the Watchung Reservation." So we all said okay. All but one of us had heard the rumors about the reservation. You know, the supposed hauntings by ghosts and devil worshippers that hang out there, but none of us really believed that. Nobody wanted to look like a chicken, so we got up and headed for the forest. It was a short drive, and we parked the car in the parking lot next to the woods. Some people called this place the Magic Forest, but others said beyond that was a place called the Witches' Forest. I had no idea how these sections of the woods were given these names or titles. We got out of the car, and one of our friends who knew the forest fairly well decided to be our guide towards the Witches' Forest. As with anything like this, there was lots of people pranking each other by poking somebody or saying, "What was that?" or tossing a rock into the woods and telling everybody, "Freeze!" It was your standard high school stuff. We made our way deep into the woods, and there was a heavy feel of oppression in the air, like the woods didn't want us there. Our guide confessed that he wasn't sure if we were on the right path or not. I said, "Great." We stopped. He tried to get his bearings as he looked around for a familiar landmark. The wind blew through the trees and various insects made their standard insect sounds. Our pathfinder scratched his head and looked perplexed, and then he told everybody to be quiet. He asked, "Do you hear that?" And somebody said, "What?" He whispered, "It's dead quiet." And then we realized that all the sounds of the bugs and the birds had gone. I felt my stomach tighten when I realized he was right. It was dead silent in the forest surrounding us. The entire world had gone still. I wondered what the hell this meant. Then we heard chanting. It was faint at first, then grew louder. At first, we thought it was a bunch of kids partying until we heard the wailing. We heard what sounded like the most unearthly moan or wail from a woman. We were so scared by this that we just grabbed hands and ran. We were moving blindly when we stumbled onto a roughly constructed altar out of branches. The forest was deathly quiet again, and we stood stock still. Then the wailing started full blast and was coming from seemingly everywhere. Full-on panic set in, and we ran full sprint for what seemed like forever, with tree limbs and bushes pulling at our clothes. Somehow we ended back at our cars, breathing so hard we thought we would pass out. And somebody asked, "What was that?" And nobody answered. After a moment, we quietly got into our car and drove away. I would go back the next day, and near the altar I found a rough circle and a star-like shape made out of rocks that had been scattered poorly to cover up the design. In the center were signs of where a candle had totally melted down in a pile of wax. Was this a pentagram? Did we almost stumble into a demonic ritual? I can't say, but I do know we steered clear of the Witches' Forest from then on.